Good morning. It's Pop again. I'll say good afternoon today because I've been doing a lot of research and note taking in preparation for today. And it's mid afternoon as I finally get around to recording. Um, I want to resume. Today is Popcast 76, and it's called Nature's Wisdom, Part 26. Um, I want to resume where we were yesterday. Talking about where where do we go from here, having set forth a new view of things, uh, with some ideas for how to lessen the Great Divide. Um, how can we put it into practical application is the question. So I talked about some of it yesterday, and I want to continue today. I want to use the light of history to give us some appreciation of our situation. I think that having a great divide is normal, though I don't think it feels that way to most of us. But I believe that it is the normal condition of the American experience uh, because it appears to be the normal condition of humans. Um, there's a lot of difference of opinion on how one best lives the gift of each other. Um, and, that's a lovely generality, but in particular, whether you're afraid of others, whether you define, others to be almost everybody except your family and friends, or the people who go to church with you, the people who live in your same town, the people from your state, the people from your country, the people from your ethnic origin. How narrowly or broadly do you define others? But there's an awful lot of people who have widely differing, everybody has personal interpretations of the experience of awe and of what it means, not only in religious responses to it, the sense of the sacred, but also in the particular details of the gift of each other. And so, as we were saying yesterday, parents have to decide when the child is sinking and when he needs to be allowed to struggle to learn how to swim. And nobody really knows exactly where the line is, but each parent has to decide for himself what to do in the next few moments. And that same thing writ large is all over the landscape. I mean, for example, right now, let's imagine that there was no political aspect to our response to coronavirus. Let's just imagine that by some lovely event, it was not at all ever involved in politics, and it was purely a case of, on the one hand, what the doctors can tell us, and on the other hand, what practicalities make us willing to take risks about. And we still have no real clear idea about whether to go back to school next month. There's so many benefits to going back to school and so many detriments in the case where there's a medical condition that's new and only been around for less than a year and scarcely understood, so that there's a high risk involved. So we would have essentially a situation where people would feel like you're making a decision that I don't agree with that affects the life and health of my children. So there's going to be a good deal of anger and a good deal of, disagreement about what's the best thing to do. So that's in an ideal world where everything is completely free of any political matters, and it's just a case of a strange new illness we don't know anything about, and the need to not shut down the world's economy for a long period of time, or in the case of education, to not harm children who are suffering from not being collectively in school together. There's things, good things that go on in character and personality development in school, from rubbing shoulders with your fellow students and with teachers. And the absence of those things are, not insignificant loss. So the point is, apply that experience to everything in life, parenting, school issues in the face of medical issues. Do we build highways in the best and cheapest place possible, even though this location may have a lot less impact on the economy, or I'm sorry, on the ecology, or this location may have a lot less impact on a community of people, who would be severely harmed by being dislocated. Perhaps they're very poor, and dislocation would be quite troubling to them. So, but if we do pay attention to cultural and social factors in locating where to build highways, it may cost quite a bit more. Um, and so, where's the balance? If we have a balanced budget, we'd see that it's even worse than that, because the money spent on relocating the highway has to come out of the pocket of what we pay teachers and firemen and such, or the money that we have available to assist the poor, to pay for medical care for needy souls, etc. So everything comes at a price, and the part of the price is it isn't at all clear. A part of the price, part of the situation is it isn't at all clear what the best decision is. So there's going to be a lot of difference of opinion, and it's pretty easy for that difference of opinion to form itself into a collective stance, where one side may have lined up a large number of items where they've identified themselves with this point of view. So, for perhaps they may be in favor of fiscal conservatism, and or cultural conservatism, and religious conservatism. Um, and the other side may have decided to take a different response to all of those things. Um, and that's more or less where we are here. And my point is, until we appreciate that this is a normal condition, we can't really appreciate what it is we're dealing with. We have had external enemies, and when we have had them, our situation was considerably, our divide was considerably lessened. So when we fought against England, when we fought against the earlier wars before that, the Continental Wars that we were fighting on behalf of the British when we were still a collection of colonies, these things created, an external enemy, and the development of, and our situation was different. But, as I said some while back, when President Jackson became president, a period of immense Great Divide uh, began around that time, a few years before, and continued until after the Civil War. Then it took a different form for 20 or so years after the Civil War, until then the robber barons grew up and became, in effect, a common enemy of the rest of America. And Teddy Roosevelt and the Trust Busters came along. But here, back in the teens and 20s, there was a Catholic priest named Father Divine. He went on the radio every day, I think every day, and preached vile hate towards a lot of people and a lot of groups. And he really sounded more like the KKK than a spokesman for the Vatican. And he was immensely popular. Um, and of course, the existence of the KKK itself. So that we've always had uh, a great divide, except in the relatively limited times when we had a common enemy. So Roosevelt presided over the Depression disastrously, tried really hard to take steps that might alleviate it, failed in almost every regard. Um, he was essentially bailed out of a series of bad decisions that actually made the Depression much worse in the later years than it was in the earlier years. Um, and after nearly 10 years of depression, the Second World War stirred up the economy. Um, and the Second World War, of course, created an enormous common enemy. During the period of the Great Depression, Roosevelt was the classic symbol for a great divide. Half the people loved him, and the other half hated him with a purple passion. Yeah, I used to work in the courthouse way back when. I don't know if I've already told the story or not. I can't remember all the stories I've told and the ones I just thought about telling. Um, I think I don't think I told this one. I worked in the courthouse, and there was a brilliant man who had gone to law school, but never practiced law. Worked his whole life in the courthouse. He'd gone to Harvard. He was a very gifted man, an interesting fellow too, and a bit of a rascal, and with a pretty much older, so he had personal knowledge of the period in the Depression. And he hated Roosevelt with a passion because he was a financial conservative and Roosevelt was not. And in particular, he hated Roosevelt's gold decision. Um, Roosevelt decided to disconnect the US dollar from gold. And whether that was wise or foolish, um, it was hotly contested during the time. So essentially, during most of the time of Roosevelt's presidency during the Depression, there was a great divide, and it was ugly. And you loved him or hated him, and there wasn't any room in between. Then the Second World War, his stature changed, and he became a wartime president, and his death was mourned greatly. He had cleverly guided us through the war. Um, and of course, much credit went to Ike as the general whose leadership was incredible. But Roosevelt was the one who had the sense to see that Ike was the right guy and to stay with him. And then we had the Cold War, and the Cold War gave us a common enemy. So, you know, most of my life, I was born in 42. Most of my life, I've not experienced the Great Divide um, because we had a common enemy. So that ended 30 years ago in the early 90s when the Russians decided that they wanted to make peace with us. Uh, and then, of course, not long after, we began the foundations of the current Great Divide. Um, I do feel obliged to mention there's the American story is not filled with tragedy exclusively. There's a lot of instances where the Great Divide existed, and the shadow side of the American experience we'll talk about in a moment. But there was also, for example, the Peace Corps, and in the Cold War, perhaps it was seen to some degree as part of the Cold War response. But in all honesty, I think it was just an expression of the best of us that came very naturally to us, and was uh, and continues to be, a major contribution to the best we can be. Um, so the shadow experience, again, this is all part of the light of history. We need to have an appreciation of our own background and circumstances so that we have a better chance of coming up with approaches that are practical and might actually succeed in lessening the Great Divide. So, the shadow side of the American experience has got two principal features: slavery and the oppression of Native Americans. And, you know, together, they're not a small part of our story. They're a big part of the American experience. They're a big part of the story. They're not a sideshow. Um, and it's very, very difficult to confront your own shadow. We're looking back in history, it's a little easier to see other people's shadows, but too much of it is still with us for us to be really comfortable with this examination. And it doesn't help to exaggerate it. I mean, the fact of a shadow is bad enough. So, for example, I was reading, Wikipedia articles. As you know, I don't claim to be a scholar, and I do my research on Facebook and Wikipedia and the like, and web articles. I read, the national papers, and I, pay some attention to news events, and I read, stories in depth, etc. But fundamentally, I'm at the Wikipedia level of research, and so there's a small group of historians who want to refer to the American oppression of Native Americans as genocide, and there's a much larger group of historians who feel that this is inappropriate. Um, and I kind of agree with them. One guy said, I just don't think that you can use experiences from one century and apply them accurately to prior centuries. That the circumstances change so much that that isn't actually very insightful into how things were. So, just as slavery included a huge physical um, harm to slaves, including death and beatings, uh, we don't generally refer to the American enslavement of Africans as genocide. Um, and the American oppression of Native Americans, uh, it's less well known in a way than the experience of slavery, but it's pretty much equally illustrative of my main point here that there are always in society a number of people who have chosen against the sense of the sacred, against awe, and against the gift of each other, and who want to live their life essentially in opposition to others. Just, it's all for me, and that's all there is. And there can't be just a tiny percentage of these. The experiences taught us that that's not true. It's more than a tiny percentage, and that group is always with us. And so, but they're not solely responsible for the evil that we do. We all participate occasionally in hate. We all participate occasionally in um, uh, things that arise from fear and so for example in business we have a legitimate fear that we could fail to provide for ourselves and our family, And that fear may make us cheat on our taxes, which is corrupt and causes, if carried too far, the corruption of the community. It might make us cheat in business in that we might not give fair value. We might double charge somebody who wasn't paying attention. We might overcharge. Lyndon Johnson told a story about a guy he worked for, and I don't know if the story is, apocryphal or if it really happened. It's a pretty good joke anyway. He told the story that he worked in this store, a little general store in some little town in Texas, and people would come in from the community, and the owner would ring up their sale always with a little Bible verse, some punchline from a Bible verse, let the little children come unto me, or, something like that. And a tourist came in from the east, and the owner overcharged him terribly. And as the man was walking away, he turned and gave the Bible verse that fit the case, and it was, "I was a stranger, and ye took me in." That, okay, so it's a joke, and it's funny, especially the way Lyndon told it. It was pretty good. Um, where he could use the accent because it was natural to him, and he drew the scene beautifully. Um, but the point I'm making is, really good people get afraid that they're not going to be able to meet payroll, that they're not going to be able to put food on the table or pay the mortgage, and for a good reason. These things happen to a lot of people a lot of times, and to some people most of their lives. So those people who have an opportunity to cheat others are very tempted to do so. It has been part of the American experience that our whole culture isn't marked by the kind of public corruption that exists in some other countries. Um, but we have constant evidence, week to week and month to month, that there's people out there, doing dirty. So they built an airport runway. They won the contract, and and a guy figured out how to put a match book. People used to smoke cigarettes, and they used to get little matchbooks from restaurants and grocery stores, and you put a matchbook in the space between the in the scale mechanism, and the result of it was that a load of cement uh, had a higher stated weight than its real weight, so that they were making extra money because they were apparently serving, let's just say, 10 units of cement, when in fact there were only 9 on the truck. So they were making a bunch of extra money. And the problem came that when the runway wasn't finished and the amount of cement delivered was supposedly adequate, either they needed a cost overrun order to buy additional cement, or they needed to prove that the supplier had somehow cheated them. And it was a lot easier to do a cost overrun and just claim that that's just how things turned out in this job. Don't really know how that happened. Um, the guy was skillful enough at pulling the matchbook out when the inspector came around, so that as far as the inspector could tell, the scale weighed 10 for 10, but it was actually weighing 10 for 9 when the matchbook was in place. And you think, oh, that never really happened, but I know for a fact that it did happen. And you look at the construction contract in Boston, the quality of cement used was deficient, and that's why the Great Dig in Boston is suffering tremendous amounts of of failures that are very expensive to repair. And so somebody cheated. And I have no idea who the contractor was or who the subcontractor was, or whether or not the inspector was paid off, or his wife was kidnapped and he was threatened. I have no idea. Think of any movie scene you want to think of. But the fact is that a vast amount of money was spent for a project that shows quality signs that indicate that there was a lot of cheating going on. And it's not confined just to large public contracts. Um, so we hear that oh, this one got a no bid contract for that, and the defense is, well, it was we were in a jam. Something happened that we couldn't have expected, and it was necessary to take immediate action. And this is a well-regarded contractor who we have reason to trust. So it actually turns out that those are true statements, and even though the guy made a little extra on the contract, he actually delivered more than fair value. He had the equipment, he had the know-how, and he got the job done in a hurry, as was needed to prevent a greater harm. Um, so, it's not always the case that you could say, oh, well, look at that sole source contract. Something corrupt has just happened. Um, that's part of why people, out of fear of failing to provide, cheat, because it's pretty hard to catch them. And I mean, I could have cheated my clients as a lawyer easily. I could have just added, a small percentage to each bill by claiming I spent a little bit more time. Um, and nobody would have caught me. I certainly could have understated my income. Some of it wouldn't have been easy for Uncle Sam to trace. Um, but I didn't. I didn't overcharge anybody, and I didn't understate my income. But there's another lawyer who maybe is overextended. Um, the economy is slowing down. He just bought a big car. He's got a big house. He's got a high standard of living. His wife is accustomed to very expensive beauty treatments and makeup, and the kids are in private school. The money's got to come from somewhere, so he steals from his partners or he steals from his clients. And you think that doesn't happen? I know a lawyer more than a little bit who was one of the most highly regarded lawyers in Maryland, who exactly that happened to and who decided to steal from his partners. Um, and I mean, people, if I told you his name, people would still say, oh, yeah, God, that was just such a shock because he was one of the most highly regarded and nicest guys. I just couldn't believe he did that, but he did it. And so, we need to appreciate that our natural selves include a lot of fear for this business of providing. And it's not foolish fear either. We often fail to provide, and the consequences are pretty damn nasty. And then there are those who have plenty but cheat anyway because they're just accustomed to cheating. It's just their way. And more, I haven't had the chance to work the shadow side, beyond a little talk about slavery. There's a lot more to say about our oppression of the Native Americans and what it tells about us. We have always a significant percentage of people who have a very narrow idea of the us them issue. And their idea of us is quite small, and it doesn't extend to Native Americans or Africans or people from the wrong parts of Europe, or people from a different religion, or people from a different part of the country. And they're perfectly willing to lie, cheat, and steal in dealing with these people. Um, and they get exaggerated fears about these people. And they can easily be manipulated by people who find fear mongering cottage industry, as such as it has in fact become. So, enough for today. See you tomorrow. We'll pick up where we left off. Take care. Bye bye.